Hello folks, welcome back to my channel Reality Check with Arvind Swaminathan. I am Arvind Swaminathan, getting ready for the budget. Now the budget is something which we come across every year. Why it creates problems for us every year and nobody bothers to take any notice of this. Now we don't seem to understand the budget creates so many problems in such a way that everybody screams, it's inflationary, it causes inflation. It's bound to, because every time what does happen? Things disappear from the marketplace because they're expecting an increase in taxes. So the same thing will appear after the budget, probably at a higher price, or at most at the same price if there are no fresh taxes. Now taxation is something I've never been able to understand properly, because why do they keep changing it every year? You don't begin to understand what it is for this year. It takes you almost until the next budget to understand it, by which time they're ready and they change it again. So we can never understand what is going on in political minds. All they mean is they want to confuse us and make us wish, where are we going? Make us wonder, what are we doing? Why is this happening? What is inflation? What does it mean to most people? I don't think anybody understands it. They just use the word without thinking about it. Now, inflation simply means if an article costs, say, 100 rupees today and it costs 101 rupees tomorrow, that is inflation, because you're paying a higher price or an inflated price for the same article. Or the other thing is, if you're getting 2 units for 100 rupees and tomorrow you get only 1.5 units or only 1 unit for the same 100 rupees, this too is inflation, because the price has doubled. If you're getting only 1 unit instead of 2 for the same price, you're paying double the amount. Basically, this is what inflation is: a higher price for the same article, or the same price for a smaller quantity of any particular article. Now this is something which nobody will explain to you. Economists will say, oh, increased money supply, it does this, people want to buy this, that and the other. But they don't explain to you what inflation really means. And I think we've just almost virtually defined inflation. Not what causes it or what it is. What does it mean to the average person on the street or the layman? Now, how do you get around this? What is it that causes this? Increased taxation? Yes. Increased prices of basic commodities? Yes. Because the moment those things go up in price, everything else will also go up. When you have what is known as galloping inflation, or the domino effect. If one thing goes up, everything else goes up with it. Now, why does this happen? Why are we so greedy, whether they're politicians or anybody else, or shopkeepers, retail shopkeepers, manufacturers, you name it. They're all just plain greedy. For instance, you see this here, small packet of potato crisps or chips. This costs 20 rupees, and today you get 52 grams worth of potato chips for that 20 rupees. Basically, it means the potato in there is being sold to you at 400 rupees a kilo, almost. Maybe 395 if not 400. Why? 4 years ago or 5 years ago, this used to cost 20 rupees for 88 grams. Then it came down to 67 or 70 grams for the same 20 rupees. Today, it's around 52 grams for the same 22 rupees. 20 rupees, sorry. Now, when the farmer is only paid basically 5 rupees a kilo, do you need a 395 rupee markup to be able to market it at what you call a reasonable profit? Now, to me, that's racketeering or profiteering. It's not making a profit. Now, so what causes a manufacturer to charge such a high markup? Surely the plant for doing it doesn't cost that much of an investment in terms of investment. So why is it so heavy in terms of markup? It is galloping inflation, not just inflation, but galloping inflation. Now, this next step is either you can call it inflation or you can say wastefulness. And we're being encouraged to throw our money away. How do we say that? This wrapped up in butter paper, you say Neutralite, which is a sort of margarine, vegetable oil looking like this. Like this, in butter paper, 100 grams would cost you 13 rupees 50 paisa. When it's put inside this little cardboard packing, it now costs 18 rupees 50 paisa. This, we're told, costs 5 rupees, which it gets thrown into the waste bin. Why are we being asked to throw our money away? We work damned hard for it. Is there no other way of making us spend money except by throwing it in the waste paper basket and creating a waste disposal problem? You think of the number of people who do this. Why are we being made to throw our money away? And I can't stress this or ask this question too often, because it happens so often. In whatever we do, we waste. Now, many other things, for instance, if the price of diesel goes up, everything else goes up because transport costs are added on. Here's another thing I don't understand. If petrol prices go up by 1 rupee a litre, why do taxi people or auto rickshaws want 1 rupee per kilometre, when that 1 rupee only costs them over a 30 kilometre distance? Why does it go up so drastically? Why is the poor consumer being killed? And literally all this goes on top of him. Where does he find the money to pay for all this? Even your everyday life is so burdened with taxation and these demands. Everybody wants. Where does the consumer go? Where does he get the extra money from? His salary or his earnings don't go up the same way. So why are we burdening him with so much that he can't even understand how does he bring up even himself, let alone a wife and children? How does he pay for all this? Now, one of the big reasons for this is every election, local, state, or country, or national. What happens? Every time there's an election, politicians go around to all the shopkeepers asking for donations, on the premise that once they're elected, the prices will be permitted to rise again, to cover up for all these donations. Now, the poor guy who has to buy all these products, indirectly, you're fleecing him, because the shopkeepers donate to politicians, and then the pair of them take it from the consumer, who has to pay for it all, or the taxpayer, who has to pay for it all. Now, you think of the amount that's wasted in terms of fuel, in terms of vehicles, in terms of wasted time of people involved in all this, the posters which have to be found, the paper, the printing, the colors, all this is a huge amount. And who's paying for it? The poor taxpayer. Because whether you like it or not, that's where it's coming from eventually. Nobody gives him a thought. Nobody cares. Why? Now he's being made to pay for something he doesn't probably even want. And yet you force him to elect people who do nothing about his problems. Now all this which is another form of extortion, if you like. There's no other thing. Whether you call it taxation, extortion, or call it an extortion racket, same thing. It's the poor consumer or the taxpayer who has to shell out. And where does he get the money from? If he isn't corrupt or if he isn't crooked, what else can he do? And then you blame him for being corrupt and you blame him for not being able to pay up. Okay, if you can't pay up, don't buy it. How does he live? Now all this means galloping inflation, because he's paying more for the same thing or the same price for a smaller amount. Now why don't the public, the politician, the government officials and everybody understand that, look, there is a limit to how much the taxpayer can pay. And inflation has to be controlled. Now I'll tell you one of the places it began was around the 1970s. Things were going along very nicely. Then they introduced a particular variety of rice, which was so poor in grain quality, nobody wanted it. And the price was very low. Having encouraged farmers to grow it, you now wanted them to get a reasonable return. So you decided to push up the price of that particular variety, without bothering to understand that the moment you did that, every other variety of rice also went up in price. There was the beginning of your inflation spiral, because every year it keeps going up and up and up and up. Why? There is invariably an agitation and people scream, farmers must get an increased MSP or minimum support price. The moment it increases, there's your inflation spiral beginning all over again. And this is invariably the beginning. There's no two ways about it. You can't get away from it. If that goes up in price, everything else goes up in price. Then the price of diesel goes up, and all this stuff has to be transported, a lot of it by trucks. When you do that, diesel prices go up, transportation costs go up, the price of the commodity goes up, which is again inflation on a massive scale. Every year new taxes are imposed, some are increased, some may be maintained at the previous level, very few actually ever go down. The government wants increased amounts of money from taxation. Where does it come from? The poor taxpayer. And he pays, whether it's through the corporate sector or through direct taxation or commodity purchases in the market. That's where it comes from. Now the government has never managed to control its own expenditure. Why? Why do they waste so much money? And why is the money that was meant for projects doesn't end up there? It gets followed up somewhere else on the way. And yet they continue to have increased amounts of taxes. Does that make sense? Well, it doesn't to me. It never did. When are politicians going to understand the population at large needs some respite from all this? They need to be able to sit down and think, have a little bit of a breather, so that they're not so frustrated, they don't feel so upset and angry. And they're angry because they can't do anything about it. It's that frustration that makes people angry. Now, what happens every year? The budget comes out. Quite often, there is taxation and extra taxes all over the place. What happens when a person finds that his usable income every month is getting reduced? He looks to ways, how does he avoid taxation? How does he not pay taxes? How does he get around them? So tax avoidance begins to become a big business. You got maybe millions of chartered accountants who are looking for new ways to find loopholes. A useless exercise which is very non-productive except for all the wrong reasons. For them it is productive. Now, there has to be somewhere where you can cry halt. Politicians must understand that, look, time to understand that whatever taxes you get, spend them properly. Don't waste them. So that you don't have to keep overtaxing people all the time. Because this is the beginning of inflation every year. And it is they who produce this effect every year and then wonder what's happening. Why do prices keep rising? Why do people get so discontent? Because their own salaries or their earning capacity never manages to keep pace with galloping inflation. It can't. It takes time to first realize it, react to it, and find new ways of making more money, which means quite a lot of people eventually get left by the wayside. They get unemployed because people can't afford to keep them employed. I mean, a person hiring 50 people, he suddenly finds a bill of 50,000 a year. Where does he get it from? He'll lay off one or two of these people at least, if not 5 or 10. Why should he have to make do with less? Just because the government wants more money out of him, well, he passes it on to somebody else. Or he adds it on to his price, so the consumer has to pay for it. And if they don't buy it, what happens to his business? That goes under. Government must also understand that changing taxes every year just drives people round the bend. Because a lot of people don't understand how the system works. Chartered accountants take a long time to understand it. So what does the average person do who's too busy with everything else trying to make that money? Now, we have to be allowed time to think a little, to put some effort into business, to put some effort into inventions, new ways of doing things. Now, we can't, if we keep having to sort of check just to deal with inflation every year. It takes up so much time, we don't have time for anything else. The other thing which one has to think about is the whole system designed to ensure that nobody can accumulate wealth, that it is a crime to become rich. Why is this so? If you take away incentives, what is there left to do anything with? Or why does one bother? That is why people who got a certain amount of money together, or wealth together, go away to other countries, because they're not allowed to use it here. We as a nation have become so enamored of foreigners. We allow foreign companies in, but we don't allow our own to even establish, let alone grow and flourish. Added to that, we drive our best brains out. We don't let them work here. And those who do work, thanks to inflation every year, cannot make ends meet. When are people going to learn, especially government officials, that the whole be-all and end-all or raison d'etre is not to drive people round the bend, but to make life easier? Now, if you keep changing taxes and tax levels every year, you're going to make people angry. Not only that, more crookedness, more devious ways of avoiding having to pay extra taxes. Why do people not take bills? Because then you have to pay taxes on it. Goods which have already been taxed at source, now the consumer has to pay again just to buy it and consume it. I mean, this is double or treble taxation. The person who sells it in the shop also has to add his margin. More inflation as far as the ultimate consumer is concerned. So how many levels of taxation does the poor man have to pay? First, the manufacturer has to get all these things from different places. He has to pay a tax in the form of not only their margins, but sales tax or something from the person he buys it from. Next, he manufactures it into whatever he is producing. Now, he exports it or sends it to the distributor in a district or a state or what have you. There's a transport tax to be paid, because all these expenses are to him taxes, and they all end up having to be paid for by the consumer. The distributor in each village or district or town, he then sells it to his dealers, who then sell it to their retailers. Now the retailer and the dealer and the distributor add on their margins. That means it's already been taxed about half a dozen times. Then finally the consumer gets it, and he has to pay the entire bill. Where does he get the time and the effort to earn that much money to be able to pay that same tax so many times? Now we're very happy when we say, we've avoided double taxation between these two countries. What about within our country? How many times does any item have to be taxed before it can be used? Are we beginning to understand where galloping inflation comes from? Now, one of the reasons, for instance, why in the old days, the old ambassador, it may have cost 20 or 21,000 rupees or 18,000 rupees. But the same car was produced and sold in England at half the price. Why? Because ambassadors, I don't think, made any product, any of its parts in their own factories. Everything was subcontracted out, right down to every last nut, bolt, screw and washer. When you do that, each subcontractor also subcontracted to 3 or 4 different, who also subcontracted out again. Now, each time it came to the next part of the chain before it got to ambassador factory, you had sales tax, excise and margin. This was probably done about 9 or 10 times. So you got to pay the same tax 9 or 10 different times, the same excise 9 or 10 different times, and the same margins to each one of them 9 or 10 times. Finally it comes, the car is assembled in the factory. When they send it out, again sales tax. And then it goes to the distributor or dealer in the city or town or village. When he sells it to the ultimate user, again tax. Now you begin to understand why everything costs so much more here. Because everything is taxed half a dozen, if not a dozen times. Now, when is government going to understand this and stop all this? Because as long as this continues, there will always be unrest. There will always be people wanting to beat the system and not pay those taxes. Or they will start extortion rackets of their own. Because as far as most people are concerned, every government has extorted money from taxpayers, whether we like it or not. Now the whole black economy began over 60 or 70 years because of excessive levels of taxation. People didn't want to pay, they revolted. It may appear quiet or silent, but when you realize that maybe 80% of the economy was black. Now, the realization started coming in the last 4 or 5 years. Many steps have been taken. But there is still a great deal to be done. When a tax is going to come to a level where people A, don't mind paying it, and B, they can start accumulating money, getting out of the old rut, and getting into a better lifestyle, a little more into their comfort zones, rather than being sort of strained all the time. And the whole reason for all this seems to be progress. Whose progress? Because if government, whatever money they collect, they manage to squander or waste or throw away, or whatever they sort of set up is substandard and it falls down every 3 years, what use is it? When are people going to understand that, look, we too deserve quality, we too deserve decent way of life, a decent amount of time to spare, so that we're not at full stretch 23 and a half hours a day. We need a little better life than this. Isn't that what government is meant for? But please, 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 in this budget, I hope something decent happens and we do get some sort of relief. Because even a slight relief is not something the government is giving us. It's our money in the first place. They're simply saying, instead of out of every rupee, instead of 2 paisa, you can now have 3 paisa. Because directly or indirectly, they're taking it all away from us. Which is why, how many people have savings? And what sort of level of savings do we have? Very little. Because 90% of people find it impossible to save anything at all for the future. What do they do in their old age? The one last thing I must point out is, a lot of companies have been guilty of using something called inflation accounting. Now this is a very odd term, and I realize, but inflation accounting simply means that they keep using different ways of increasing prices, not by investing anything, but by claiming to invest, something which they have not invested at all. Now, if the government understands this and takes active methods or steps to deal with it, fine. Otherwise, unfortunately, this will continue. And inflation is something we have to go on living with, whether we like it or not. Well, folks, thank you for listening to me and to my channel, Reality Check with Arvind Swaminathan. If you like it, please subscribe, like, and share. See you next time.